Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Realistic Outdoors. This one I really think you should pay attention to. It was one of the most unique ones I did. I built the trim from scratch. It was way too much to order. It was going to cost me like another $1,200. I had only $2,000 to build this whole thing. So I built the whole thing from scratch using a sheet of aluminum. I hope you enjoy it. It was really interesting to make, so stay tuned and let's jump right into it. Before we get too far into this, I really want to thank Cutter Creek Outdoors for coming on board. I'm so proud to be working with these folks. They have an amazing store. It is one of the best places that you can get any of your fun stuff. From hunting and camping, and oh my goodness, you should see their airsoft selection. They have one of the best. Don't take my word for it. Find out for yourself. Just trying to work out a proof of concept. I think I might build that trim that way. Cut a piece of metal to cover that and braze it. And then comes just straight down. Finish it on the outside. Same on the inside. All the way up. Now I would say that after all the hassle that I did go through, I wish I did braze it, because you'll see in a bit here that I actually ended up not brazing based on somebody else's opinion, and bad news. There is so many good videos on how to braze, and I really wish that I had done it. It was a little more money, but in the end it would have saved me a lot of time. Most of my molding I made from scratch. I took a big sheet of aluminum and I just cut pieces in. I measured what I needed for inside and outside, and so then I cut 3¼ inches off each piece here like this. And then I measured with my speed square that I was 1 1/2 and a tiny bit in on each side, so that when I bent it, and here's a piece that I just bent, just cleaning up the sharp edges. So I took it into my bender, and the most I can do is 36 inches. So I planned my door accordingly. I played with several pieces, practice pieces that I made, how many cuts I needed to get the radius just right on my camper, and how far apart they needed to be so that when I bent them together they wouldn't touch. And this one test here ended up being 1/2 inch apart, and it was perfect. And on this one particular piece on the inside of the door, I only needed 7 actual segments, and so I set my square up and I measured the 7 segments back onto this piece on both ends, because I wanted it centered in the door so that it would droop down both sides, which you'll see coming up here. So once I got these all measured and transferred, I headed over to the saw and cut these pieces up. I didn't like how this was sitting in my saw, so I added a hunk of wood in between. That worked so much better. Cutting on the opposite side took a little bit of ingenuity, so I clamped it to a board, and then the board stood off of my actual saw, which allowed me to cut the other side, which worked out okay. Okay, so I just bent those 2 pieces, or 2 ends that I just cut, and I'm just going to clamp it in place and see how it looks and how it feels. This is like more my advanced test to see if this is something I'm going to want to do. It ended up being the actual thing I wanted to do, and I did use this exact piece. So I just had to tweak the corners a little bit so that they would fit the door. And I had to tweak the door a little bit because I cut it perfectly out of this hole. So adding the trim around the door and adding the trim around the door frame, I had to of course remove a little bit of material. So it was no problem, no big deal. I did tape the ends where I put the clamps, just trying to protect it, but in the end, you know, I was going to end up gluing a piece on top and sanding it and etc. So it probably wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever, but here we go anyway. Might as well protect it now and see. Hey guys, this was pretty technical and I hope you found some value in this. And if you have, please consider subscribing, like and comment, ring that bell so that you can hear more about this coming in the future, because there will be more episodes dropping, and the final tests. And there'll be a whole list later that we've decided in this episode later that I'm going to do a list of all the things we learned from this build so that it'll be all compiled in one. And for the straight edges, it was basically the same thing. I measured out what I needed and then I brought them out and cut them to length with my angle grinder here, and then I had to trim a little bit off so it would fit below the door. Once I had them all bent up, I put a few screws in here just to hold it in place and see where we could go from here. And it's looking really good. Pretty happy with this at this point. And so now I have to think about what's the trim going to look like inside the door on the door itself. So here's a little test. I just put a couple pieces together just to see what it would look like. And that's kind of what I think I went with, was this style here. So then I just cut some pieces and attached them right to the front of the door. I mentioned earlier I'm going to have to remove a little bit of material from the door just to accommodate the two pieces of trim, one on the outside and one on the inside of the door. So here I'm just using my electric planer just to remove like 32nd at a time. Works out pretty good. Trims it nice, even the aluminum sheet. Here's a little boo-boo I did. I rounded the corners and then at the top, so then I was like, okay, I'll naturally round the corners at the bottom. And that was a mistake because the hole at the bottom was square. And so I ended up with little gaps at the bottom that I had to deal with. They weren't deal breakers, and in the end, with the trim behind and sealed off, I've decided that they're going to be used for drainage, so they're not the end of the world. I'm not sure where my video went of me making these patterns, but basically I put a piece of cardboard onto the trailer itself, taped it, and then I marked it with some felt pen, and then I cut the pieces out, and then I laid them on top of this aluminum, and now I'm just going to cut them out. And these are going to be the covers that go over top of where the cuts were to allow the bend of the metal. I clamped this onto a sacrificial piece of plywood. It just made the cutting so much easier than it just jerking and shaking all over the place. So this made the cuts easier, and it was a scrap piece of wood anyway. Once I had the pieces cut, I glued them into place, covering up those curve cuts using a Lord adhesive, which aluminum on aluminum is like welding. It is almost impossible to pull them apart without ruining the aluminum. It's a fantastic product. Once they were hardened overnight, I just used my sander with some 220 grit and I sanded the edges smooth, and I tried to do some of the transitions and remove the glue and just smoothed out everything as best as I could and got it ready for the next stage. Here's a closer look of it all sanded up and getting closer to the next stage where I'm going to add some Bondo. Just mounted it back in place, want to see how it looked there, and I can see that these ledges are a little bit too big, so I'm going to want to put something in there to level the frame off. Now the pieces are cut from around the door, I am going to glue them into place, and now I'm going to measure out what I need for the outside frame, which I'm going to actually use 10-foot pieces of aluminum that's 1.5" by 2" reveals, and I'm going to use the 2" on the inside and the 1.5" on the outside. So I just built a little jig here in my saw so that it'll only cut through using my stop guide here, and you'll see here this is where it'll stop dead, and a better shot of it right before it gets to cut through. So now I'm going to cut the pieces of aluminum and cut the curves into this for bending around the outside of the camper. Okay, now I brought it inside and I just basically laid it right onto the camper, and it folded almost naturally around the curves. And I just used some string to measure where the curve should start and where it should end. And then I transferred those measurements onto my 10-foot pieces of angle, and then once that was on there, I sanded up the corners. Probably didn't need scuffing because I'm pretty sure the glue is going to go through these curves, but I sanded it, scuffed it up anyway. And now I'm going to use the Lord adhesive again to glue these pieces on. So I'm just going to do some prep tape here, make sure it doesn't stick to my siding, because I'm going to glue them in place so that when I take them off, they maintain the shape that I want. Just like always, prior to gluing and painting, I always use my grease and wax remover. So I'm just going to clean these up before I stick the glue on there. And there's that Sign Lock adhesive by Lord. Amazing stuff. I had originally planned just to tape these on to hold them in place, but they weren't giving enough pressure, so I had to stick a few screws into them. And I knew I was going to be using a little bit of Bondo to hide the edges anyway, so I thought it might as well fill the holes with the Bondo too, so I stuck a few screws in them. That way I can guarantee a nice pressure while it hardened. Okay, now that it hardened, I can just take these off, take them out of the shop, and actually sand the edges so that they're nice and smooth. So it didn't take very long. I just used my power sander, belt sander. Okay, stop the show. I'm gonna have to turn this segment into things I've learned or lessons I've learned. You can see here there's some reddish materials on the trim now. That was a lovely fellow who I went into an automotive store and I told him I have transitions between aluminum and I needed to make something that I could sand off and have barely visible line. Paint over it and it disappears. The fellow sold me this Bondo, but it wasn't 2-part and I didn't know any better, and he was positive after I showed him the pictures of what I wanted to do that this was the product I needed. Took it home. 3 or 4 times I did this, and every time I'd come out it would crack. So obviously I should have known better, but he seemed so enthusiastic about selling me that exact product that was what I needed that I didn't even question it. So I ended up going back, sanding all of this off and using a 2-part epoxy, and then you'll see that in a couple more seconds. But anyway, another lesson learned. I should do a whole video at the end of all the lessons I've learned while making this camper. In fact, that's a fantastic idea. Thanks for telling me that. I will, and I'm going to. That's a great idea. Anyway, back to the show. One really big step closer to finishing. I still have some trim to put down there, but I'm not going to do that today. Okay, there's the 2-part epoxy that I actually use for filling now, which is like a 2-part Bondo, and I just sanded it off flush, and then I was able to paint right over top of it on the first go. Should have used that first. How'd I know? Lessons learned, right? I hope you guys will learn from this. Now I'm going to use some self-etching primer because I'm going to be using lacquer. So this is a self-etching lacquer primer made by, I believe it's Trimclad. I'll put up a picture right here if I have one. Once that was ample time to dry, I came back with the lacquer blue, and I really wanted green, but anyway, blue is also in my logo, so I really just wanted that logo that I'm going to put on the side to pop, and this was a matching blue from it, so it was perfect. So once this was painted, it looked amazing. I was really happy. Little sign guide trick here, we just put all our screws into a box and paint them that way. Works easy. Now I just preset on some butyl tape all the way around, 3/4 inch width, and I put that all the way in place so that when I put this on top, it should be a watertight seal, but even after that, I'm going to silicone it as well, or use some Sikaflex, something that's a little more flexy. It's meant for marine and kind of resists mold better, so you tend not to want to use just regular silicone because it'll end up getting black and moldy. So just get this into place here and then put the screws back into it. It's looking good. The contrast is amazing. It looks pretty stark right here, but once I put my graphics up on the side, it just blended beautifully. So now I'm just using my pre-painted screw heads here and fill in the blanks. And then I just repeated everything from the other side. Where the metal joined, there's butyl tape. Everywhere under the trim is butyl tape. And this is just prior to me actually hitting it with some Sikaflex, which I don't usually do until the very end, just before I'm ready to go out. There wasn't much more that I did to this point. Just made sure that all the screws were fairly well spaced. I think I used 5 inches as an actual measurement, and it went in nicely, and I'm super stoked with how this turned out. I did leave the little bit of aluminum color around the inside of the door. I don't know, I kind of like the contrast, and I just thought a little extra blue was too much, especially after I put the graphics over top of it. It kind of gave it a little bit of a separation or a pop. So overall, I am absolutely amazed and impressed with the look of and finish of this. I can't believe every time I go in to see it that I built it. It did take a lot of time to get to this point. There's still a bunch to go, but I couldn't be happier. Well, that was it for this episode. It was intriguing. I learned a lot. I hope you guys learned some too. It's very detailed, and there's a lot of things I would do differently, which we spoke about, but I really enjoyed how it turned out, and it looks absolutely fabulous. So it was a win either way, but a few things I would change to make it a little easier and probably a little more robust. Thanks for hanging out. I'm Scott from Realistic Outdoors. So stay tuned. Thank you for subscribing. Stay tuned, and thank you for subscribing. Holy smokes. Stay tuned, and thank you for teaching me how to speak. No, stay tuned and please subscribe.